we are ready to begin our paraphrasing exercise. Through this exercise, I'm going to guide you through the principles that you've been reading about in your textbooks and hopefully make it a little bit more clear, a little more understandable as to why a person would paraphrase. So if you would get out your MLA handbook as well as your text where your author's work is, and if you'd also get out a notebook and a pen to take some notes, that would be wonderful. We'll get started on learning more about paraphrase. Now, first, every good paraphrase starts with finding a quote that just communicates the concept really well. Whether that is a striking quote that you know you're going to use word for word, or whether that is a quote that you think, well, I really like the concept, but I'm probably going to put it in my own words. The but put it in your own words is the paraphrasing part. So one good tool for researchers is to do what we're about ready to do, which is to take notes and to find those quotes, but also to really consider what do we need to represent in the paper itself. I'm, for example, reading Martin Luther King's Letter from Birmingham City Jail. So that's the book that you see in front of you and a few of my notations. And I happen to have found a really awesome quote right in this paragraph here towards the bottom of the page. Let me make it bigger for you here. This paragraph that begins, "You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, etc.? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that is constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored." This spoke to me. I don't know, whether I'm going to use it in the paper as a direct quote or not. Realistically, this is way too long to use in a paper, and I wouldn't want to include all of those pieces. So just for the purposes of recording a note, here's what I've typed into my paraphrasing exercise. I have a direct quote right in here, so I've deleted the type your direct quote here information, and I have put in the exact phrasing from Martin Luther King that I believe he really called for some great direct action. This spoke to me, and so I'm recording it. As a researcher, as a writer, I still do not have to decide whether I want to use that exact phrasing or not. For the purposes of our class, I want you to become accustomed to the idea of paraphrasing because it's going to be a majority of what you do. A direct quote is good in the circumstances where something is super clearly stated, has a lot of emotion and or some clear logic, or is stated by someone who is an authority within the field. But even authorities within the field, you might decide that you want to paraphrase something. And paraphrases, the whole intent for paraphrasing a direct quote is to avoid using too many voices in the same paper. If you're going to be citing 6 different works, you're going to have 6 different authors' voices in your paper. How clunky and choppy and off is that going to sound? Very. So what paraphrasing allows you to do is to put that direct quote into your own words so that you have some fluidity to your argument. Or every time the reader turns around, he or she is not hit upside the head with somebody else's way of looking at the argument. So reserve direct quotes in the papers for those things that are really well stated and paraphrase the rest. The majority of your paper is going to be written by you and is going to use source material from several other places, but will have your consistent voice anytime that you've used that other resource. One other thing that I want to point out to you is here at the very bottom of the quote, King 205. What is that? That is a citation for a direct quote. You're using those exact words from Martin Luther King on page 205, and that will link up with a works cited entry eventually that has all of the book information where a student could go and find that particular quote or that particular paraphrase eventually. Okay, so let's talk about what is paraphrasing. I've already given you a little bit of background. Bullet number 1 here, the writer changes the words from the direct quote into his or her own way of phrasing. So we don't use the resource's way of phrasing that concept. We instead turn it into our own. Bullet point number 2 here. The writer does not copy words, phrases, sentence structure, or logic from the original. This is completely worded. What I found that students like to do when they first start paraphrasing is they write out a sentence, they write out the direct quote, and then they consult a thesaurus or just swap some other words in for a few of the words and leave it. Well, that's called copying. You are copying the sentence structure, you're copying the logic, and you're potentially copying words and phrases from that original quote. That makes it plagiarism. And so what we want to do is we want to look at the original quote and think about the original quote, but we don't want to borrow too much from it. We just want to find, what concept do I need to relate from this quote? If I'm not going to use the exact words, what concept can I explain to people? And that's what a paraphrase is, essentially. Bullet point number 3, cannot take the materials out of context. This is a biggie. Taking material out of context means that you are changing what the original author intended into what you intend. And what that means is that you are bending the meaning to fit your purpose, or you're lying. That original quote or that original material did not reflect that point of view, or you might not be the extreme of lying, but maybe biasing the content. And you can't do that. If you're going to change the meaning of something, then be honest and explain it in the paragraph. While this does not pertain in this exact manner, the logic can be adopted for this. And so you'd use a transition between that concept in order to ground it within your paper. But you don't want to change the meaning of the original context. The final bullet point here shows you a bit of a ratio. The writer changes 1 to 2 sentences of quoted materials into 1 to 2 sentences of paraphrase. So if you have 1 sentence quoted for the quote, then you're going to have 1 sentence quoted for the paraphrase, most likely. And the only exception to this, or the only thing that I would change to this is, I'm quoting about 4 sentences or 3.5 to 4 lines worth of content. I think I can get my paraphrase into maybe 2 lines or maybe 1 sentence. I think that'd be better than relying upon 3 or 4. And that goes back to bullet point number 2, that it's not going to copy the original phrasing or sentence structure or logic from the original. I'm going to just borrow the concept that I really need, and I'm going to put it into my own words. Another idea that students, when they are first citing and putting material into the paper in regard to paraphrasing, is that paraphrasing must be cited. It has to be cited where you're using that material in the paper. So either in the sentence, you might name the author and then offer a page number in parentheses at the end, or you might put the entire citation at the very end. So that's what you saw with my example with King a few moments ago, that the parenthetical citation was at the very end of the quoted material that I borrowed from his letter. A writer must not just cite in the paper itself, they have to cite also in the works cited page. So the King 2005 then points down to the works cited page where a reader can go and read that entire passage in the context of the original. They can actually go find that book or find that article or whatever the resource is and be able to view or listen to whatever that point of view is, because you have given all the bibliographic information for that particular resource. So it must be cited in the text and it must be cited in the works cited page. May I give you a few exceptions to the completely rewords or completely reworded description? Our 3 exceptions are going to be numbers, proper nouns, and discipline-specific terms. Now, numbers, you're not going to change the number 1 from Arabic numeral form into wording form unless your documentation style guide tells you. So does the MLA handbook tell you to change numbers to words, or does it tell you to change them to Arabic numbers? That's based on the guide. So when you get into APA, there are slightly different rules than in MLA. As a general rule of thumb, numbers 0 through 10 are going to be spelled out, or if it's 11 or higher, generally speaking, you're going to represent it in Arabic numeral form. Again, go to the guide, look up in the index numbers, and find where the information is about how to represent them, and go and read about it. Now, the big caution that I want to make in regard to numbers is some students will see the number 26 cited. 26% of people do not brush their teeth. I'm making that up, of course. 26. They want to somehow not use the number 26. Oh my gosh, I'm going to plagiarize if I use the number 26. No, you're not. You've got to use that number because that's the number presented. Now, could you change that to more than 25% of people do not brush their teeth? Of course you could. But do you have to? No. You can represent numbers how they are represented in the original form. It's the wording around them that you want to really be cognizant of, whether you're changing or whether you're changing the meaning of it. And be careful with approximations. It really gets me when journalists on TV will say 2 million people, and the truth is that it was 1.8 million people. Well, that's not 2 million. That's still 200,000 people short. That's a big number to me. Maybe it's not if you're talking dollars and you're in a multi-trillion-dollar business, but it's a lot of money. It is a lot of people. And so in regard to honesty in my research, I would put 1.8 million. I would not put nearly 2 million. So you got to really think about how you're communicating your information to people, and are you bending it and maybe padding it to make your numbers sound bigger. You can't do that in research. To do that is to fib, to lie, to misrepresent information. And as you get into your field, you're going to see where you can do that. What is close enough? What would be statistically significant to allow you to say 2 million instead of 1.8, or how close to 2 million do you have to be in order to actually represent it that? And can you say nearly 2 million, or can you say 2 million itself? That'll be something that'll be specific to your discipline, to your field of study. Number 2, you do not have to rephrase proper nouns. To call New York City the Big Apple would be silly and would be slang. So just call New York City, New York City. If you're writing about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or about the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, use those words themselves. You don't have to change them to something else. Number 3, discipline-specific terms. If you're a nurse and you are speaking to a doctor or to a patient and you refer to something cardiorespiratory something or other, okay, you're not going to change that for those audiences, right? Cardiorespiratory, we understand, has to do with the heart and the lungs. If you've studied in a health class, and everybody has in high school, but that brings up an interesting question about audience that we'll talk about too. But cardiorespiratory, you need to use those examples. Or how about cervical cancer? If I were to leave out the word cervical and just say cancer, that would change the entire meaning. So that's one of those cases where you're going to be taking that resource out of context if you omit something. So just use the term cervical cancer. With our next example, the turgidity of a plant. Okay, you might have to look up what does the word turgidity mean. That is a term within that field that you would not want to change. Now, let me give you another example. The theory of deconstruction. I use the theory of deconstruction in my literature classes regularly after a certain point in the class. Now, because my classes consist not of English majors typically, I might have 1 or maybe 2 per semester, but overall they're general liberal arts students. And so if I were to just start talking about deconstruction, they would start doing a lot of head scratching and would have no idea what I am talking about. The theory of deconstruction. I don't know, I've never heard it before. So as an instructor, an expert in the field, talking with my students, the very first time that I mention it, I have a responsibility to explain what I'm talking about. And so what I will do in class is I will talk about the theory. I will give a definition. I will also cite and lead those students to a great resource to understand that theory. And so I've done my due diligence as an instructor in defining who is my audience and what do they know and what do they not know, and have led them to a resource. Now, if I were speaking to a bunch of colleagues at a conference and I were talking about how I use deconstruction in the classroom or in my literature class, I wouldn't have to define that term, would I? I'm talking to a bunch of colleagues, they understand what I'm saying. If I started defining deconstruction, they would go, holy moly, are you kidding me? This is not Intro to Lit 101. This is a bunch of colleagues who have used that theory plenty. So that is one consideration in regard to discipline-specific terms. Let me give you one final example that a student goes, Shannon, I want to study, or I'm going to study addiction, and specifically meth. And I have found this definition that fits into your discipline-specific terms, and I'm really struggling with how to represent it in my paper. And the reason why is because it explains it in not just a physical manner, but in a behavioral manner that I don't think other people have ever heard of before. Normally that would be considered another thing called common knowledge that we're going to talk about in a moment. And if you're an adult, you pretty much understand a basic definition of it. What she was communicating is that she recognized that it was a discipline-specific term and possibly even kind of a common term that who would need to define, but because she found such a moving definition of it, she wanted to include it in her paper. Well, first of all, I asked her, I said, are you going to quote it or are you going to paraphrase it? And she wanted to quote it. I said, well, if you've got a direct quote, you have to cite it, right? Well, if she were going to paraphrase this, what would be the guideline? You'd need to cite it. If it's something that you found was significant and you think that people could truly benefit by reading more about it, then you should go on ahead and cite your resource. And people will tell you to back off, if you are overciting. The key here, should any of this be cited or not? Yes. Information in a paraphrase must be cited, period. If you're getting this information from another resource, you need to cite it. If you're getting a number from another resource, a fact, some data, you have to cite that. Where did you get that data? Did you research it or did some other expert research it? Discipline-specific terms, for the most part, you're going to need to cite them at this stage in your career. But there probably will be a time where you can back off a little bit with that. In general, if you're paraphrasing, go on ahead and cite it. And this brings us to our question of what on earth is considered common knowledge. You're going to find again, as you dig deeper into your studies and as you get into some of your majors classes, that the definition of what is common knowledge is going to change. I've given you examples already with the literature example of deconstruction, as well as thinking through turgidity in a plant. And so these same concepts kind of overlap into common knowledge, but let me give you a bit more of an example. If the information is viewed in multiple resources, in general, possibly 4 or more times, it's probably common knowledge. It cannot be copied word for word. If you use word for word information, you must put that in quotes. But honestly, if it's in 4 or more resources, and you're changing it into your own phrasing, then it may not need to be cited. Common knowledge could be cited. It should if a resource proves valuable in understanding the material, such as that example of addiction. That student wanted to lead her audience to one of the best definitions and in understanding it far better than she had even understood it. And she was near the end of her degree. Then, yeah, go on ahead and cite it. Again, somebody will tell you to back off if you don't need to. Let's look at the example that I have put in front of you in regard to the paraphrasing exercise. So I have my original King citation and quote in here, and what I've added on to that is I've added a paraphrase here at the bottom. Can you find anything that is plagiarized? Well, we might say that negotiation is copied in both of them. Do you see that in the first line with the direct quote and then also the last line of that paraphrase? However, how else are you going to state negotiate? or negotiating. Is that a word that we could use right there? Well, yeah, I'd consider it a discipline-specific term that could be used here. What else is potentially plagiarized? Anything else? Well, in the original piece, they mentioned sit-ins and marches, that sort of thing. But if those actually happened, is that really what we're focusing on here? Not so much. Overall, the phrasing is okay in this paraphrase. Not too much is copied. Not too much is taken out of context, and nothing is really taken out of context. It might be clarified a little bit, but not overdone. If we're looking at the direct quote, we have 4 sentences here, some of them longer than others, that have been condensed down to 2.5 lines. And with this example, that's really decent for a paraphrase. You want it to be very economical, you want it to be very brief and to the point. And so I would say even the size or the length or the ratio of this paraphrase compared to the quote is good. We have clearly cited in the text, have we created a works cited entry for it? We could look down in the works cited page and oops, if I have not created one for King, then I need to make sure that I create one. So overall, this paraphrase is pretty decent. So what you're going to be looking for are copied words, copied language, copied logic. You want to make it portable, you want to make it your own, but at the same time you want to be true to what the original quote said. Does this bend anything that the quote said? No. Does it copy anything? No. And is it cited properly? Yes, it is. That is our ultimate goal here.